Good afternoon, everybody. We are here for the last webinar of this cycle of webinars in the framework of the project Feeding Knowledge. The last webinar is about the priority number 4 on sustainable development of small rural communities in marginal areas. Now, I'm just starting with a short presentation about the project in general. So this is just, as you know, we had webinars on all the 5 priorities on which the project is focused on. Okay. So the main idea of Feeding Knowledge project was develop knowledge as a way to identify substantial solutions for food security that really meet the needs of countries. And the main objective is creating opportunities for dialogue and development through a Mediterranean network of experts. The network should be focused on research, innovation, and transfer of knowledge for food security. So, as I already told you, there are 5 priorities in the framework of this project. The first one is sustainable natural resources management. The second priority is on quantitative and qualitative enhancement of crop products. Then the third priority is on socioeconomic dynamics in global market. Priority number 4, which is today's priority, sustainable development of small rural communities in marginal areas, and then we have the 5th priority, Mediterranean food consumption patterns, diet, environment, society, economy, and health. Now, what are the main results of this project? Expected results is building a Euro-Mediterranean scientific network on research and innovation for food security. This is done through the setting up of an international technology platform. The name is Feeding Knowledge, and we will have time to illustrate, to show you how it works. And then there is the creation of 12 focal points to support knowledge development at local level. And then the objective of these focal points is also to provide support to national extension services to transfer research results and listen to stakeholders' needs. The final result is to provide through all the documents that are the result of the white papers, the documents that every priority is expected to produce will be to provide support to policymakers for the elaboration of effective policies of research and innovation for food security. The scope of the project is mainly the Euro-Mediterranean region, so North Africa, Middle East, and the Southeast Europe countries with Albania and the Balkan countries. All after 2015, so after the Expo, Milan Expo 2015, the project activities will be extended to other areas in the world. So they will involve more regions in the world. So far, we have implemented a set of activities. The first one was the organization of a cycle of webinars focused on the main objectives of each priority. There were 5 webinars, as the priorities were 5. They started in December 2012 and ended in March 2013. In general, there were almost 200 attendees. There is a second cycle of webinars, and this one today is the last one of the second cycle that involved 6 webinars and started in March 2013 and in today. We were talking about white papers, so the second objective was the drafting of 5 white papers, and after all the white papers are finalized, the main findings will be summarized in a policy document. So what the white papers carry out an analysis of the state of the art of research for each priority and identify main research needs and, in order to drive policy recommendations. Another result is the launch of an international platform, the www.feedingknowledge.net, and this platform supports exchange and development of research, knowledge, and ideas on food security. Creation of a network. All these activities are aimed also at creating a network of researchers and experts that will focus on research, innovation, and transfer, dissemination of knowledge for food security. Naturally, we invite everybody to get involved with the activities of the project, and this is possible through following us on Facebook, on Twitter, and especially on the website, as I said, www.feedingknowledge.net. So, thank you for your attention, and we expect to share our ideas on food security with you. And if you want to get in touch, this is the email, you can see it. Now, okay, so now I'm going to introduce you Professor Graham Woodgate, who the professor will hold the final webinar for the priority number 4. Professor Gate is a professor at the University College of London, at the Institute of Americas. He is a principal teaching fellow, specialized, his expertise is on environmental sociology and agroecology. The webinar will be on agroecology and sustainable food systems, empowering local communities towards food sovereignty. So, Professor Woodgate, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you very much to the organisers for inviting me to present this webinar and to contribute to Priority 4, Sustainable Development of Small Rural Communities in Marginal Areas of the Feeding Knowledge Programme. My presentation today concerns agroecology and sustainable food systems, and how the agroecological approach can be used to empower rural communities and smallholder farmers towards the attainment of food sovereignty as a vital element of sustainability and also as a protection against food insecurity. Now, I chose the title to reflect the fact that at the beginning of this year, the Journal of Sustainable Agriculture changed its name to become Agroecology and Sustainable Food Systems. And because today my presentation draws quite liberally on the first issue of the newly titled journal, to which I am a contributor. So in the introductory article to the special edition of this newly re-entitled journal by Mendes, Bacon and Cohen, there's an identification of two broadly different streams or currents in contemporary agroecology. First, there's agroecology as a science that focuses on the analysis of ecological processes at the farm and landscape scales. But second, there's an agroecology which is not only a science, but a set of rural production practices and also a social movement aimed at the transformation of agro-food systems through transdisciplinary, participatory research and action. So my intervention today comes very much from the second of these two traditions and begins with a consideration of the ontological underpinnings of the case I wish to make. That's to say that I'm going to begin by explaining briefly how I conceive of the world and of our human condition. So, in his historical materialist approach, Marx conceptualized the underlying motor of historical change as the never-ending struggle of people to generate from nature the things needed for their survival. From a transdisciplinary socio-ecological perspective, this ongoing struggle for survival leads to the progressive development of what Marx called the forces of production, but which we might think of as forms of energy and technology. Progressive technological developments give rise to processes which prompt social and ecological change. We change the world through our technologies, and in the process, we might say, we change ourselves. That is, through the day-to-day reproduction of social and ecological structure and the dialectical process of existence, people refashion the world in which they live. Our agency, or our ability to change the world, is an ecological as well as a social attribute. Society and nature are themselves dialectical partners, so that social agency is also ecological agency, and ecological agency has social impacts. My talk today then concerns the contested domain of agri-food systems or food regimes, and in particular concepts of agroecology, food security and food sovereignty, and their relationship to the sustainable development of small rural communities in marginal areas. Agroecology builds on a long history of concern about the negative social and ecological impacts of capitalist economic development on the ecology and sociology of agri-food systems. As long ago as the 17th century, Winstanley, a central figure in the English diggers movement, challenged one of the fundamental elements of capitalism, private property. He said that when men take to buying and selling the land, they restrain other fellow creatures from seeking nourishment from Mother Earth, so that he that had no land was to work for those that called the land theirs. And thereby some are lifted up into the chair of tyranny, and others trod under the footstool of misery, as if the earth were made for a few and not for all. In the 19th century, as Britain's industrial revolution gathered pace, agricultural production grew rapidly. Yet in his text on agricultural chemistry, von Liebig criticised Britain's success, pointing out that yield increases depended on imported nutrients, while none of the organic residues from food consumed in the cities was recycled to the soil. Drawing on Liebig's work, Marx developed one of the central concepts of his critique of industrial agriculture. As Britain transitioned from agrarian to industrial society, capitalist agriculture provoked what Marx described as an irreparable rift in the interdependent process of socio-ecological metabolism. The capitalism of agriculture, the development of capitalism in agriculture, said Marx, is a progress in the art of robbing both the farm labourer and the soil. At the turn of the 20th century, in Russia, Kautsky, Lenin and Chayanov, among others, were debating what Kautsky had called the agrarian question and contemplating the fate of the peasantry in the face of the development of capitalist agriculture. What would happen, they wanted to know, to the autarkic smallholder farmers when capitalism began to develop? Would they differentiate into small-scale capitalist family farmers and rural workers, as Lenin believed, or could they reproduce themselves at the margins of capitalism under an alternative production logic and food regime, as Chayanov suggested? That question was answered quite quickly by Stalin with the collectivization of the Russian peasantry and the development of the Soviet food regime. However, let's move on to the end of the First World War and consider how agricultural industrialization was boosted by the changeover of the munitions factories from the production of explosives to making agricultural chemicals and fertilizers. The impacts of that chemical agriculture led to criticisms from the likes of Albert Schweitzer and the biodynamic movement, and Albert Howard, whose book An Agricultural Testament, 1943, is seen as one of the foundational texts of the organic movement. Following the Second World War, the Green Revolution introduced hybrid seeds, fertilizers, pesticides and irrigation to the Third World in an effort to modernize peasant agriculture and boost agricultural output. While significant yield increases were achieved, the new technologies also generated unattended social and environmental consequences. Now, these consequences were picked up in Mexico in the 1950s and 60s by Efraín Hernández Xolocotzi, who led extensive field surveys of the immense agrobiodiversity present in the fields of Mexico's peasant farmers. But when he saw how the Green Revolution plant breeders were using this genetic richness to create hybrid varieties that focused purely on raising yields, he started another movement. And in that struggle, he called attention to the strength of traditional peasant agriculture in Mexico and tried to keep it from being displaced. And this effort culminated in a national seminar in 1976 entitled Analysis of the Agroecosystems of Mexico. So we can see from this brief review then that the second current of agroecology that I outlined at the beginning of this presentation builds on a long tradition of science and social action. In the 21st century, agroecology has attracted the attention of agrarian social movements. And from its inception in 1993, La Via Campesina has developed into the world's largest social movement, It has member organisations in more than 70 countries around the world and represents some 200 million smallholder farmers worldwide. For La Via Campesina and the farmers it represents, agroecology helps to build autonomy from unfavourable markets and to restore degraded soils. La Via Campesina is highly critical of the corporate food regime and demands the adoption and pursuit of policies towards food sovereignty. Coming into fruition in the post-1980 neoliberal era, the present corporate food regime comprises vertically integrated agri-food conglomerates, government ministries, global financial institutions, agricultural research institutions, and large philanthropic concerns that set institutional arrangements, generate food security discourse, and patent protected technologies, as well as enforcing the regime's rules, such as free trade agreements, such as the US Farm Bill and the European Common Agricultural Policy. 21st century population projections, projected to reach 9 billion by the middle of the current century, food prices and the global financial and economic crisis have prompted speculative capital to look for new investment opportunities in the global south. And as commodity prices have risen, investments in agricultural land and production have become increasingly attractive. Since the 2008 food price crisis, international institutions such as the FAO, World Bank and IFPRI have produced a series of reports calling for a 70% increase in food production by 2050 and indicate that investment in biotechnology and a new green revolution as appropriate vehicles for achieving this. These claims rest on some very problematic assumptions, however. Assumptions which include the growing consumption of grain-fed meat in the emerging economies, more and more arable land being diverted to agro-fuel production, continued financial speculation and price volatility in food commodities, the idea that production increases are actually dependent upon transgenic proprietary technologies and industrial inputs, and the need for a liberalised global trade in order to achieve global food security. Now, of course, all of these assumptions can be questioned, and there's no recognition at all that the proprietary green revolution agriculture and liberalised global markets are themselves implicated in our 21st century food crisis. The view of the World Bank and the FAO appears to be that agricultural modernisation and market liberalisation have simply been inadequately and inefficiently applied. Therefore, the solution that they suggest is to do more of the same with a greater area and with greater efficiency. Faced with stagnant global economic growth, however, this paradigm views small farmers and rural communities as sites for accumulation by dispossession, as Harvey has suggested, and as a sector for potential market expansion. As in the 1960s and 80s, capital's key to the small farmers' land, factor and commodity markets is a green revolution. And just as the first revolution required funding by philanthropic organisations such as the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation, this new green revolution is being funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And they have the task of resurrecting a consultative group on international agricultural research and obtaining broad financial and government agreement around the notion of global food security. However, rather than representing a route towards the sustainable development of small rural communities, the global food security narrative, at best, in my opinion, seeks to integrate smallholders into the corporate food regime by establishing public-private partnerships, microfinance schemes, smallholder contract farming, village-level agricultural input and output traders. At worst, the recent wave of investment and capitalisation is placing agribusiness in direct and growing conflict with small farmers and peasants worldwide. So while the corporate food regime is based around large-scale conglomerates and industrial production that is decontextualized and de-linked from the specificities of local ecosystems and social relations, smallholder agriculture, by contrast, is usually based on short and decentralized circuits of production and consumption with strong links between food production and local and regional ecosystems and societies. So, with respect to feeding a global population estimated to reach 9 billion by the middle of this century, Armin has estimated that sufficient food to feed this population could be produced on as few as 50,000 megafarms. However, as with the first green revolution, the capitalist system will be unable to absorb surplus labour, environmental degradation will be exacerbated, and ecosystem services further compromised. Thus, an alternative model needs to be developed and implemented if current trends towards increasing food insecurity are to be reversed. One such proposal is bound up with the concept of food sovereignty. Agrarian social movements in the South and food safety social movements in the global North are responding to the global food security discourse of corporate food regimes with narratives that highlight the benefits of smallholder agroecological farming and feeding the world's growing population with healthy, locally produced food. They also tout the benefits of good stewardship of the rural environment, the preservation of ecologically adapted cultural heritages that have emerged over many generations in small rural communities, and of diversified agroecosystems that are not only resilient to climate change, but which can actively combat global warming through the sequestration and storage of atmospheric carbon. At the same time, these social movements are mounting their own critiques of the corporate food regime, accusing it of producing unhealthy food and generating inequality, greenhouse gases, hunger, environmental devastation, GMO contamination, pesticides poisoning, and a host of other maladies, including the loss of rural cultures and livelihoods. So in their struggle to reconfigure the conceptual domain of the challenge to combat poverty and food insecurity for a growing population, social movements are seeking to construct in society a consensus for the defense of smallholder communities against corporate land grabbing, to build support for land occupations by landless peasants, and to establish appropriate institutional arrangements for the pursuit of food sovereignty based on agrarian reform, local markets, and ecological farming. And as evidence of the growing force of this counter-narrative, on the 25th of May this year, some 2 million people marched in protest against the corporate seed giant Monsanto in hundreds of rallies in more than 50 countries. March Against Monsanto protesters stated that they wanted to call attention to the dangers posed by genetically modified food and the food giants that produce it. Now, the concept of food sovereignty itself was established by the international smallholder movement La Via Campesina. And at the 2007 Forum for Food Sovereignty in Mali, the Nailini Declaration was adopted, and this states that food sovereignty is the right of peoples to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural systems. It puts those who produce, distribute and consume food at the heart of the food system and asks for policies at the heart of the food system and policies rather than demands of market and corporations. It defends interests and inclusion of the next generation. It offers a strategy to resist and dismantle the current corporate food regime and proposes directions for food, farming, pastoral and fisheries systems determined by local producers. Food sovereignty then prioritises local and national economies. It promotes transparent trade that guarantees just income to all peoples and the right of consumers to control their own food and nutrition. Now, given this definition of food security, we need to consider the institutional arrangements that will be required for its successful implementation. So, among these institutional arrangements for food sovereignty, we can highlight the following. Constitutional guarantees. Now, we already have significant global experience in developing these guarantees. Ecuador, for example, in its 2008 constitution, enshrines rights of nature and the goal of food sovereignty. And food sovereignty is also integrated into the national constitutions or laws of Venezuela, Mali, Bolivia, Nepal, and Senegal. Second, we can look at agrarian reform and note that this needs to be state-led reform, not the market reform that we've seen in the neoliberal area, but state-led reform that guarantees smallholders ownership and control of the land they work and returns land to those that have been dispossessed. Access to land, we can say, should be available regardless of gender, religion, race, social class, or ideology. And how about protecting the environment and biodiversity? This requires legislation. In Brazil, for example, there is legislation which controls the amount of forest which farms are allowed to clear when they establish new ranches in and around forest areas. Intellectual property rights, another very important area for legislation and control. Why should multinational biotechnology companies be granted intellectual property rights overseas when the cultures and communities where the original germplasm was domesticated have no such rights? Maize, for example, was developed in Mesoamerica over a period of 7 to 10,000 years. There were thousands of different varieties of maize, and yet today Monsanto is allowed to claim intellectual property rights over the varieties that it has developed based on no more than 10 or 20 years of research and development. It's been estimated that in the 1970s and 80s, germplasm for breeding provided by small farmers in Latin America and Asia contributed $10 billion a year to the United States corn and soy production markets. We also need to think about unequivocal limits to be set on the use of synthetic biocides and fertilizers to reduce eutrophication and the hypoxic ocean zones that are caused by agricultural runoff, such as the large areas of dead areas of the Gulf of Mexico. Possible policy regulation also needs to be considered for agroecosystem carbon content, so that the diversified polycultural agroecosystems of peasant farmers are seen to have value by effect of the carbon that they sequestrate and store. National agricultural policies need to promote the satisfaction of domestic consumption requirements before exports. We can also say that food sovereignty is undermined by multinational corporations and speculative capital, so that regulation and taxation of speculative capital and a strictly enforced code of conduct for transnational corporations have both been proposed by the Forum for Food Sovereignty. We also need to think about democratic control and good governance of public institutions and policy. Smallholder farmers, if they are to have a chance of achieving sustainability in their isolated rural communities, must have some direct input into formulating agricultural policies at all levels. Finally, we can say then that the agroecological approaches to the development of more sustainable food systems or regimes and the promotion of food sovereignty, whilst once fairly marginal in the policy arena, have begun to shift towards the centre stage. Agriculture at a Crossroads, a 2009 report of the International Assessment of Agricultural Knowledge, Science and Technology for Development, proposed agroecology as a promising approach to resolve the interrelated global problems of hunger, rural poverty and sustainable development. Subsequently, Oliver de Schutter, the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, has continually advocated the use of an agroecological approach for tackling global food insecurity and food sovereignty issues. The institutional arrangements just outlined are indispensable first steps in empowering smallholders and rural communities to work towards the goals of food sovereignty and thus establish a more sustainable food regime. So let's think further about empowering smallholder communities. There are many definitions of power. Joe Rowlands, in a 1997 publication, distinguishes among 4 types of power. Power over is the type of coercive power that results in win-lose situations, employed, for example, when multinational food conglomerates dictate the market price for commodities and small-scale producers become simple price takers. The goal of empowerment is to assist rural communities and smallholders to resist this sort of coercive power by helping them to build power within, power with, and power to. Power within is associated with our self-belief and allows us to believe in and aspire to a better world for ourselves and for our families. Power with refers to the mutual support and solidarity the key is to building political alliances to promote community interests. And together, power within and power with produce power to, the agency that we all possess, which allows us to make a difference in the world. By working with smallholders in rural communities and validating their production practices and decision-making criteria, we can help them to empower themselves and develop their learning and innovation capacities. More importantly, empowerment enables people to engage in political action and participate in state institutions in order to influence the design of public policies that create a favourable institutional framework for the development of sustainable agroecosystems and food sovereignty. Now, the agroecological approach, together with some other approaches, suggests numerous empowering mechanisms. But what I want to do is just to leave you today with a few examples of the type of empowering mechanisms that we can use. These are the low-level institutional arrangements, if you like, from which power is gained and developed. So, as agroecologists, we should be supporting community campaigning groups to gain political recognition and develop political capital, to fight for agrarian reform and to win inclusion in policy-making fora. Community cooperatives. These allow people to benefit from economies of scale by bringing together their resources and experiences in production, processing or distribution. Credit unions or rotating loan groups are community banks that can provide farmers with small loans to undertake investments in sustainable agriculture without subjecting them to the onerous interest rates and eligibility criteria of commercial banks. Farmer research groups. Farmer research groups can facilitate community development by allowing smallholders to set the research agenda and providing an institutional setting to allow scientists to work within the complex dynamics of existing agroecosystems. Of particular importance are farmer-to-farmer groups. Farmer-to-farmer groups spread knowledge and understanding of productivity-enhancing and resource-conserving methods between local farmers. This is how the first agricultural revolution took off in the United Kingdom and Europe. It wasn't through extension services, it was through farmers communicating with each other. These farmer communication platforms are vital. Farmers learn more easily from each other than they do from professional extension agents. Local consumer organisations are also important institutions. They can stimulate the market for local agricultural products, allowing farmers to retain more income and consumers to buy their food more cheaply, including the exclusion of intermediaries who take profit from the production process. Local resource management organisations are also valuable contributors to the sustainability of rural communities. They form a basis for community-led action in such areas as reforestation, irrigation management, or soil and water conservation schemes. Machinery rings or circles share the cost of owning machinery, and multi-stakeholder innovation platforms promote learning and innovation competencies by bringing together diverse interests, experiences, and capabilities. So to conclude, we can say that when agroecology is seen more than just a technology-oriented approach that seeks ecological substitutes for industrial inputs, and is viewed instead as a field of endeavour that encompasses and integrates transdisciplinary, participatory, and action-oriented approaches, and engages critically with the political economic issues that affect agro-food systems, then its potential for empowering smallholders and rural communities should be readily apparent. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor Woodgate. And now we are going to give you some details about the priority 4. Okay, 1 second. Okay. So, as I said, the priority 4 on sustainable development of small rural communities in marginal areas. And the members, the team is formed by Lamberto Lamberti, Virginia, which is myself, Annalita Antonelli, Roberto Capone, and as international expert, Graham Woodgate. In detail, our staff. So Roberto Capone is the head of Division of Sustainable Agriculture, Food and Rural Development of Siam Bari. Then Lamberto Lamberti, our senior technician for the priority and is officer researcher of the same division in Bari. Then myself, Virginia Belsanti, I work here as a consultant in the same department, Annalita Antonelli, and Graham Woodgate, that I already introduced to you, Principal Teaching Fellow of Environmental Sociology of the Americas at the University College of London in the Institute of the Americas. And then we have our technical support, Siam Bari, Laura Scivette, Marinella Giannelli, and then from the team from Milan, from the Politecnico Milan, Valeria Baudo, Gianfranco Elia, Paola Corti, and Francesca Concia, who are supporting us with the technology, with the platform we're using, all the technical aspects and communication aspects. So to proceed to work within our priority and interface with our groups and to enrich our research and to share as much information and knowledge as we can, we're using some collaboration tools. So the main ones are Dropbox, we're using Skype, and naturally we're using email. About the white paper related to priority 4. As I said, okay, the name is the Sustainable Development of Small Rural Communities in Marginal Areas, and the main idea is to stress the importance of rural smallholder communities in the global fight against hunger and the contribution to food security. This idea starts from considering a specific context which is witnessed in food crisis due to high prices that are impacting on the poor, a growing population that calls for an increase in global food production, and addressing increasing food production towards biotechnology and large-scale farming, but at the same time considering that we are acting on a scenario that sees scarce natural resources, so depleted natural resources, so also biodiversity, and the climate change that needs adaptation to the climate changes. In this background, we have rural people that represent 48% of the total population, which they represent, at the same time, they represent 70% of the global poor, and they're mainly small-scale producers, but at the same time, they are feeding more than 50% of the global population, and there is more potential left for them. The white paper is based on some main concepts and definitions that are developed on different levels. So as Professor Woodgate already illustrated, the main principles are agroecology and food sovereignty, and then there are a set of definitions that will be developed in the paper, rural definitions about some elements we're talking about, rural communities, small-scale producers, rural livelihood systems, livelihood diversification. We're talking about local groups and organizations and associated institutional arrangements, and power and empowerment. Now, the main objective of this white paper is to identify rural communities, small-scale producers, and local government and non-governmental organizations as crucial actors in the struggle to end food insecurity and contribute to the sustainable development of rural areas. And then also to provide an overview of the situation in the southern Mediterranean and Near East region, drawing on a range of international reports based on the agroecology concept and the goals of food sovereignty, and identifying key areas requiring research. The specific objective of our white paper are to outline the situation of smallholders and rural communities in the southern Mediterranean and Near East region in terms of geographical and social context, agroecological resources and farming systems, livelihood strategies, political and institutional context, and environmental, social, and economic challenges. And also to identify which aspects need additional research to provide a more targeted and specific set of policies to address development deficits and achieve food sovereignty and avoid food insecurity. If you want to get involved, you can start from accessing the website for the project, which is feedingknowledge.net/IT, or you can interact on Facebook and on Twitter. If you decide to register on the website, you can do so by signing in, and then after you have signed in, just giving a username and a password and choosing a password, you will see, if you click on network, you will see the list of the 5 priorities. You can select one or more priorities you're interested in, click on it, and your request to join the priority will be accepted by the site manager. So each priority as an administrator, for example, for priority number 4 will be me, and I will accept it has to be clear the institution you're coming from and your interest, and we will accept so we can enlarge our network. And you're able to follow the document developments, but also to follow discussions that we are creating in the forum. So, thank you for following us on this webinar, and now Professor Woodgate will answer the questions that have been asked during the presentation itself.
Thank you, Virginia, and thanks to everybody for the questions that they have sent in. The first question there is from Hamid. Hello, Hamid. Hamid asks, how can MENA countries that are net food importers become food sovereign and self-sufficient without jeopardizing irreversibly their meager natural capital? Well, a flippant answer, a brief and flippant answer, Hamid, is they can do this by adopting the agroecological approach, precisely by adopting the agroecological approach. So that instead of following the market for agricultural commodities and producing through mining fossil water and producing crops that have a high price on the international market, instead they look to the endogenous potential that they have in their own crops, in date palm, for example, in the own crops that are from the region, and the skills and the agroecosystems that have been developed by people living in the area. So I think I should also underline that food sovereignty and food self-sufficiency are not the same concept. If you live in a country where there is a greater population than it will be possible to feed from your natural resource base, as I do, as the UK is, for example, where we have more than 60 million people, and we do not have sufficient area to produce all of our own food, we cannot be food self-sufficient, completely food self-sufficient. So food sovereignty doesn't necessarily mean being self-sufficient, but it does mean making important choices about what will be produced. And perhaps we should think more about following our ecological and cultural advantage rather than trying to follow our comparative advantage in the global marketplace. The next question comes from Nuruddin. Hello, Nuruddin. And you say that it's well known that agroecological practices, and particularly research in agroecology, struggle with many obstacles, such as inconsistent research investment, as well as lock-in, accumulation of barriers and constraints, marginalisation of small-scale farmers and agricultural policies and decisions, absence of security of land tenure, etc., absence in mainstream trade, etc. So in order to achieve the scaling up of agroecology and ensure food security and sovereignty, what are the key principles that you suggest to Mediterranean states, policy and decision makers? Well, Nuruddin, I think the key thing is to take charge of your nation's policies, of not opening yourself up simply to market forces. The neoliberal period has been seen to be problematic. We have the national crises, economic crises in the countries of the European Union. We have the problems in the United States. These problems trickle around the world. And if we think that the answer to the problems of trade liberalisation are greater liberalisation, then I think we're sorely mistaken. And so the key principle, I would say, is taking hold of markets and returning to an era when agricultural production was at least under the view of the state, under the purview of the state and regulation, rather than being left principally to the market. Economics should follow ecological principles. Economics is about the management of the house, our planet, the planet that we live on. Ecology is about the logic, the wisdom of the house, how the house works. And until we base our economics on our ecological understanding, we're going to subject ourselves to further and further crises. Tariq, what form of irreversible jeopardy am I referring to? Most of the MENA region is desert. I'm not clear what you mean by irreversible jeopardy that I talked about. But for example, we can say we were having a conversation prior to this webinar about the significant investment speculative capital is moving into the desert regions of the south of the region that we're particularly interested in the Feeding Knowledge program, and how wells are being drilled by speculative finance capital. Land is being taken away from pastoralist systems and used to produce forage crops for livestock, to produce meat products for growing global consumption for grain-fed meat. Now, the view of this kind of production is get in, make a profit, and get out again. If those projects last for 20 years and then exhaust the water and have salinized soils, there will have been an adequate return to capital to make them a profitable and interesting option for speculative capital. What they leave behind in their wake are devastated natural resources. Desert systems are capable of producing. They're capable of producing under a nomadic pastoralist system. They are not capable in the long term sustainably of producing under a high capital investment irrigation system. And what these systems leave behind them are cultures which have lost their knowledge of how to produce in these systems, and they leave environments which are degraded by salinization and solidification. And further questions? Okay, Florence. Actually, FAO is not a homogeneous body. Most of us disagree with what is presented as the FAO World Bank approach and work on other issues such as the right to food and access to natural resources. Yes, Florence, thanks. I knew I was going to attract some criticism for people working in the FAO. I do understand that it's not an homogeneous body, but nonetheless, the policies of the FAO at the global level are implicated in the success and the development of the corporate food regime, which is a structured food system which mitigates or militates against the survival of small-scale communities and smallholder producers around the world. So it's great to see some of the good work that's being done by FAO and by people in FAO and in the World Bank. But at the same time, we do have to look at the underlying assumptions which support the global prescriptions of these institutions which have such a significant effect on the global food and agriculture industry. Marinella, how can the agroecological perspective for food sovereignty be included on agricultural research systems or included within agricultural research systems? You know, the key way of doing this is first of all to adopt an agroecological approach, that is to start from the endogenous potential of the ecosystems and the cultures where the agricultural research system is based. So it's going out and looking and talking with farmers about their agricultural production systems, not looking necessarily for the barriers to integration into the world system, but looking at the possibilities that these local systems have for generating food sovereignty in that particular area. So the first thing I would think is that you need to unite with farmers, that researchers need to unite with farmers at that basic level. Now we have another question from Hamid. Hamid says, what are the policy interventions and instruments and governance or institutional arrangements needed to make the Mediterranean food system more sustainable, especially from the environmental or ecological point of view? Well, my background, whilst I do have some background in ecology and environmental studies, is more as an environmental sociologist. But the key point of the agroecological perspective, as I've just said in relation to Marinella's question, is that we need to start from endogenous potential. What are the local systems? How have they developed? What are the cultures that support them? So the kind of policies that we require are policies which support that kind of research. And notwithstanding the comments that Nuruddin made in his question about the accumulation of barriers and constraints, we need to try and work with local farmers to understand. I think I'm also now responding to question 7, also from Khaled, about some examples of sustainable food systems or models that respect agroecology. We need to start from the basis of what is possible. What are the historical forms of production in this area, and not what are the signals that are given to us by global food markets. In seeking to build food sovereignty from an agroecological perspective, we need to start with the endogenous potential of a particular region, and that potential is visible to us in traditional landscapes, such as the oases of the desert regions of northern Africa, the polycultural production systems that exist there, and the different cultures that have produced these agroecosystems. So we need to look at these things together, culture and nature coming together to produce agroecosystems that are diverse, that have the capacity to feed people and to minimize environmental impacts, and to actually start to mitigate some of the damage that has been done through the implementation of industrial agricultural policy over the last 200 years. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Woodgate, for answering all these questions. And before thanking you all for being with us this afternoon, and I would like to thank you also for having followed all the webinars for all the priorities, the 5 priorities. As I told you, this one was the last one for the second cycle. So, I mean, just wrapping up all the results of these adventures, we can tell you that all the webinars have seen about over 200 attendees, so we're happy about this result, and we would like to thank all of them for being so patient to accept our having accepted our invitation, and also that if you would like to see the webinars that you've missed some, or you'd like to see once again the webinar, you can do that by accessing the platform, accessing the website for the project, which feedingknowledge.net, and you can do so by selecting events. So you just type feedingknowledge.net/events. So you have a chance to rerun the webinars. Now, everybody interested can register on the website, and by doing so, you can take active. You can start being collaborative. You can start contributing to the project in several ways. So once you register, you can select a priority, and we will show you how you can contribute. You can contribute in several ways by increasing our database, our research, and our sources, and also contributing to the discussions. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.